"You're not worth my time. Get lost," he shouted, his eyes cold, his words slicing through the fragile heart she once trusted. 4 years later, the tables turned in a way he could never have imagined. She wasn't just back. She held the power to take everything he had built. But this wasn't revenge. This was justice, calculated with a patience that could destroy empires. Who really betrayed whom, and what price would be paid when secrets long buried were finally exposed? Hey, my wonderful family. Welcome back to Mr. James' Family, where we dive deep into stories that touch your heart, make you feel every emotion, and keep you on the edge of your seat. Grab a cup of tea, get comfy, and let's journey together through a story of love, betrayal, and the power of resilience. Trust me, you won't want to blink, because every moment counts. Let's get started. Working, living, none of them knowing a life had just been dismantled. She replayed the moment in her head. Not the accusation, the conviction. Alexander hadn't questioned. That hurt more than the words. She pulled out her notebook. Old habit. She wrote one line. If the data is wrong, the motive matters. She closed the notebook. She didn't cry. She stood, and she walked forward. Back at Sterling Tech, the logs arrived. Alexander reviewed them alone. They told a different story than the report. Access points overlapped, credentials rotated internally. The breach wasn't external, it was intimate. Someone inside the system, someone trusted. Alexander's pulse slowed. That was worse. His phone buzzed. Victor. He ignored it. Instead, he opened a secondary log, one even Victor didn't know existed. A legacy safeguard his father had insisted on, buried deep, untouched for years. It took time. Phoenix resisted. Then it opened. A shadow trail appeared. Admin-level movements, cleaned, hidden. Alexander felt cold. The access signature wasn't Leila's. He knew her patterns, her rhythm. She was methodical but curious, careful but human. This signature was surgical, efficient, almost bored. His phone buzzed again. Victor. This time Alexander answered. Yes? Board members are asking questions, Victor said. They're nervous. We need a unified narrative. Alexander stared at the screen. What narrative is that? He asked. That you acted decisively, Victor replied. That the threat is neutralized. Alexander ended the call. He stood there for a long moment. Then he whispered, to no one, "What have I done?" That afternoon, Alexander found himself standing in front of Leila's empty office. Her desk was cleared. Too clean. She'd left with intention. He touched the edge of the desk lightly. A memory surfaced. Her laugh here, late nights, quiet support. He pulled his hand back. This wasn't nostalgia. This was consequence. Victor watched the security feed from his office, expression unreadable. Alexander was digging. That was a problem. Victor opened a secure channel. "Accelerate Phase 2, he said calmly. The voice on the other end confirmed. Victor leaned back, eyes darkening. If Alexander wanted truth, he would give him just enough to destroy himself. Late that night, Alexander received an automated alert. Phoenix Protocol, internal breach, detected source, executive-level authorization, COO. Alexander's blood ran cold, and for the first time the question wasn't who betrayed him, but how far that betrayal had already gone. The alert didn't disappear. It stayed on the screen like a quiet accusation. Alexander didn't move at first. He stared at the words until they stopped feeling like language and started feeling like weight. Internal breach detected authorization. Koo. His mouth went dry. The building was silent at this hour, but his mind wasn't. Thoughts collided without order, without mercy. The system hadn't glitched. Phoenix didn't make mistakes. It reacted. It recorded. It remembered. Someone with executive clearance had touched the core. someone he trusted. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again as if the truth might rearrange itself out of shame. It didn't. He reached for his phone, then stopped. Calling Victor now would accomplish nothing. Lies sharpened when confronted too early. He needed clarity before confrontation, proof before emotion. He forwarded the alert to a secure offline drive and disconnected the terminal. Phoenix went dark. That alone was a risk. Shutting it down could cost millions, but leaving it exposed could cost everything. Alexander stood, jacket forgotten on the chair, and walked to the window. The city below was restless, alive, unaware that a silent war was unfolding above it. For the first time in years, Alexander didn't feel taller than it. He felt smaller, exposed. Across the city, Leila sat alone in a near-empty apartment she had rented that morning. It wasn't much. Neutral walls, second-hand furniture, a single lamp casting a warm, imperfect circle of light. She preferred it that way. She placed her notebook on the table again, opened it, and stared at the last line she'd written earlier. If the data is wrong, the motive matters. She added another beneath it. And if the motive is fear, the truth is usually close. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. She wasn't ready for voices yet. Instead, she opened her laptop, not to search for Alexander, not to defend herself, but to rebuild a sense of control. She pulled up old system diagrams she'd once glimpsed over his shoulder, concepts she'd absorbed without realizing their value at the time. She didn't have Phoenix, but she understood its philosophy. Of his empire had just been pulled out from beneath him, and somewhere deep inside the documents he trusted so blindly, a truth waited, patient, hidden, dangerous. That night, long after Leila was gone, Alexander reopened the folder. For the first time, he noticed something small, a timestamp. It didn't match. And suddenly, certainty began to tremble. Alexander didn't sit down. He stood there with the folder open, the city lights bleeding through the glass walls behind him, turning the paper pale and unreal. The timestamp stared back at him like an eye that refused to close. 2:17 a.m. He checked the next page. 2:17 a.m. Again. Too clean, too consistent. Phoenix access logs were chaotic by design. They shifted, fragmented. Even he couldn't predict them fully. Yet here, perfect alignment. A pattern where randomness was supposed to live. His thumb brushed the corner of the page. A strange sensation crept into his chest. Not panic, not guilt, unease. He flipped the page again. Slower this time. The server ID listed was external, European-based, encrypted through a proxy he himself had approved months ago, but only for disaster simulations, never for live data mirroring. Alexander frowned. Why would Leila even know about that proxy? He closed the folder, then opened it again. This time, he pulled his laptop closer, fingers moving on instinct. No calls, no alerts. Just him and the system he trusted more than people. The terminal opened quietly. Phoenix responded like it always did, obedient, secure, loyal. He typed in the timestamp, 2:17 a.m. The system hesitated. That hesitation was new. Alexander's jaw tightened. Phoenix didn't hesitate. He reran the query. Same pause. Then a message blinked on the screen. Access log archived. Admin override. His eyes narrowed. Admin override required 2 signatures. His and Victor's. Alexander leaned back slightly. Victor Hale, his COO, his father's final recommendation. The man who had been beside him longer than anyone else in that building. The man who handed him the report. Alexander exhaled slowly through his nose. There was a simple explanation, he told himself. There always was. Victor handled operations, security protocols, emergency redundancies. If anyone could authorize an archive, it was him. Still, Alexander pulled up the raw logs. They loaded line by line, messy and imperfect, exactly how real data looked. The fabricated report hadn't been messy. It had been polished. His fingers stilled. He remembered Leila's face when she said, "This is fabricated, not defensive. Certain. Certainty didn't come from guilt. It came from knowing the truth." Alexander shut the laptop, harder than necessary. "No," he muttered to the empty room. He wasn't doing this. He wasn't reopening wounds. He wasn't doubting himself. That way lay weakness. He poured himself a drink instead. The glass trembled slightly in his hand before he steadied it. He didn't notice. Morning came without rest. The city woke beneath him, unaware that a fracture had formed high above its streets. Alexander arrived at the office earlier than usual. Too early. The building hummed softly, half asleep, lights dimmed, corridors echoing with distant footsteps. He liked it this way. Quiet made control feel easier. Victor's office light was already on. That irritated him. Victor looked up as Alexander entered, smile immediate, practiced, warm. "Rough night?" Victor asked. Alexander studied him closely for the first time in a long while. Victor looked the same. Immaculate suit, relaxed posture, eyes sharp but unthreatening. The face of stability. "Security logs," Alexander said flatly. "From last night." Victor didn't blink. "I assumed you'd want them," he replied. "After everything." That pause was subtle. Everything. Alexander crossed the room slowly. "You authorized an archive at 217, he said. "Why?" Victor leaned back in his chair. "Containment," he said easily. "Once suspicion arises, you isolate data. Standard protocol. You didn't notify me. I didn't want to distract you while emotions were high." Alexander's lips pressed together. Victor stood, moving closer, lowering his voice. "I know this is difficult," he said. "Betrayal always is, especially when it comes from someone you trusted." Alexander's gaze hardened. "Don't," he warned. Victor raised his hand slightly, peaceful, concerned. "I'm on your side," he said. "I always have been." The words slid into place too smoothly. Alexander nodded once. "Send me the raw logs," he said. Victor hesitated. "Just a fraction." Then he smiled again. "Of course." Leila spent the morning in silence, not because she was broken, because she was reorganizing herself. She sat in a small cafe far from the glass towers, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. People moved around her, laughing, working, living, none of them knowing a life had just been dismantled. She replayed the moment in her head, not the accusation, the conviction. Alexander hadn't questioned. That hurt more than the words. She pulled out her notebook. Old habit. She wrote one line. "If the data is wrong, the motive matters." She closed the notebook. She didn't cry. She stood, and she walked forward. Back at Sterling Tech, the logs arrived. Alexander reviewed them alone. They told a different story than the report. Access points overlapped. Credentials rotated internally. The breach wasn't external. It was intimate. Someone inside the system. Someone trusted. Alexander's pulse slowed. That was worse. His phone buzzed. Victor. He ignored it. Instead, he opened a secondary log. One even Victor didn't know existed. A legacy safeguard his father had insisted on, buried deep, untouched for years. It took time. Phoenix resisted. Then it opened. A shadow trail appeared. Admin-level movements. Cleaned. Hidden. Alexander felt cold. The access signature wasn't Leila's. He knew her patterns, her rhythm. She was methodical but curious, careful but human. This signature was surgical, efficient, almost bored. His phone buzzed again. Victor. This time, Alexander answered. "Yes?" "Board members are asking questions," Victor said. "They're nervous. We need a unified narrative." Alexander stared at the screen. "What narrative is that?" he asked. "That you acted decisively," Victor replied. "That the threat is neutralized." Alexander ended the call. He stood there for a long moment. Then he whispered, "To no one. What have I done?" That afternoon, Alexander found himself standing in front of Leila's empty office. Her desk was cleared. Too clean. She'd left with intention. He touched the edge of the desk lightly. A memory surfaced. Her laugh here, late nights, quiet support. He pulled his hand back. This wasn't nostalgia. This was consequence. Victor watched the security feed from his office, expression unreadable. Alexander was digging. That was a problem. Victor opened a secure channel. "Accelerate phase 2, he said calmly. The voice on the other end confirmed. Victor leaned back, eyes darkening. If Alexander wanted truth, he would give him just enough to destroy himself. Late that night, Alexander received an automated alert. Phoenix Protocol, internal breach, detected source, executive level authorization, COO. Alexander's blood ran cold, and for the first time the question wasn't who betrayed him, but how far that betrayal had already gone. The alert didn't disappear. It stayed on the screen like a quiet accusation. Alexander didn't move at first. He stared at the words until they stopped feeling like language and started feeling like weight. Internal breach detected authorization. COO. His mouth went dry. The building was silent at this hour, but his mind wasn't. Thoughts collided without order, without mercy. The system hadn't glitched. Phoenix didn't make mistakes. It reacted. It recorded. It remembered. Someone with executive clearance had touched the core. Someone he trusted. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again as if the truth might rearrange itself out of shame. It didn't. He reached for his phone, then stopped. Calling Victor now would accomplish nothing. Lies sharpened when confronted too early. He needed clarity before confrontation, proof before emotion. He forwarded the alert to a secure offline drive and disconnected the terminal. Phoenix went dark. That alone was a risk. Shutting it down could cost millions. But leaving it exposed could cost everything. Alexander stood, jacket forgotten on the chair, and walked to the window. The city below was restless, alive, unaware that a silent war was unfolding above it. For the first time in years, Alexander didn't feel taller than it. He felt smaller, exposed. Across the city, Leila sat alone in a near-empty apartment she had rented that morning. It wasn't much. Neutral walls, second-hand furniture, a single lamp casting a warm, imperfect circle of light. She preferred it that way. She placed her notebook on the table again, opened it, and stared at the last line she'd written earlier. "If the data is wrong, the motive matters." She added another beneath it. "And if the motive is fear, the truth is usually close." Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. She wasn't ready for voices yet. Instead, she opened her laptop, not to search for Alexander, not to defend herself, but to rebuild a sense of control. She pulled up old system diagrams she'd once glimpsed over his shoulder, concepts she'd absorbed without realizing their value at the time. She didn't have Phoenix, but she understood its philosophy. That understanding settled something inside her. Whatever had happened wasn't random. It was engineered. The next morning, Sterling Tech buzzed with nervous energy. Executives whispered. Emails multiplied. Meetings were scheduled, canceled, rescheduled again. Alexander arrived without ceremony. He didn't go to his office. He went straight to the server floor. Security hesitated. "Sir, this area—" "I know," Alexander said, voice calm but unyielding. "I built it." They stepped aside. The server room was cold, lights blinking in quiet rhythms. Phoenix's physical heart pulsed behind reinforced glass, a machine that had made him powerful, and now vulnerable. He stood there longer than necessary, grounding himself. Then he accessed the emergency audit interface. It was limited, slow, old, but it was honest. The breach hadn't extracted data. It had modified permissions. Phoenix wasn't stolen. It was being prepared. Alexander's stomach tightened. Prepared for what? Victor watched from 2 floors above. He saw Alexander's movements on the internal feed and felt irritation, not panic. Panic wasted energy. He had planned for suspicion. What he hadn't planned for was how quickly Alexander would adapt. Victor adjusted his cufflinks and smiled faintly. Accelerating Phase 2 meant applying pressure, not force. Alexander would fracture on his own. He always did when control slipped. Victor picked up his phone and sent a single message. Proceed. Alexander returned to his office to find Victor waiting. That alone told him something was wrong. Victor rarely waited. You shut Phoenix down, Victor said casually. Yes. That will raise alarms. So will a hostile takeover, Alexander replied. Victor tilted his head slightly. You think we're under attack? Alexander met his gaze. I think someone wants me distracted. Victor chuckled softly. You're exhausted, he said, and emotional. That word again. Emotional. It landed differently this time. I want a full executive audit, Alexander said. All access, all channels, no exceptions. Victor's smile faded, just a little. That could destabilize confidence. So could lies, Alexander said. The silence stretched. Victor exhaled slowly. If that's what you want, he said, I'll support it. Support, not lead, Alexander noticed. Later that day, Alexander reviewed archived communications, emails, calls, meeting notes. Patterns emerged. Victor had positioned himself as the filter between Alexander and the board. He decided what reached him and what didn't. He framed crises, offered solutions before problems fully formed. Alexander had accepted it gratefully. Trust was efficient, too efficient. His gaze fell on one particular thread, a recommendation. 4 years ago, marriage advice. The timing aligned too perfectly now. Alexander leaned back, heart pounding. He had thought the marriage was his choice. Had it been guided? He stood abruptly. He needed air. Leila walked into a co-working space that afternoon and signed a short-term contract. No introductions, no explanations, just work. She sat down, opened her laptop, and began mapping an idea she hadn't named yet. Something ethical, something resilient, something that couldn't be weaponized against the people it served. Her fingers moved steadily. Pain sharpened focus. She wasn't running from her past. She was building past it. That evening, Alexander received another alert. Not from Phoenix, from legal. A minor subsidiary had been sold quietly, efficiently, without his direct approval. Victor's signature was on the authorization. Alexander felt something settle into place. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It was gradual, intentional. He poured himself a drink and didn't taste it. Then he did something he hadn't done since the divorce. He pulled up Leila's number. His thumb hovered. Then he stopped. Whatever truth he was uncovering, he had no right to drag her back into it. Not yet. Victor closed his office door and reviewed the status update. Everything was moving faster than expected. Alexander was closer to the truth than anticipated. That was fine. Truth didn't save people. Timing did. Victor opened a new file. Inside it was a contingency, a final narrative. If Alexander reached the end of this road, he wouldn't find redemption. He would find ruin. As midnight approached, Alexander received one last notification. Not from Phoenix, not from legal, from an encrypted source he didn't recognize. The message contained only one line. She was never the threat. And beneath it, a timestamp that matched the night his marriage ended. The message stayed on the screen longer than Alexander expected, not because he didn't know how to delete it, because deleting it wouldn't erase what it had already done. She was never the threat. The words were simple, almost gentle. That disturbed him more than accusation ever could. Threats demanded reaction. This demanded reflection. Alexander leaned back slowly in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His office felt different now, not hostile, exposed. He checked the sender again, encrypted, masked, routed through channels that no outsider should have known existed, which meant this wasn't a random warning. It was intimate. He opened the metadata. The timestamp matched the night he told Leila to get lost. The same hour, the same window of time when certainty had overridden compassion. His throat tightened. Someone had been watching, not Phoenix. Him. Alexander shut down the monitor and stood, pacing the length of the room. Each step felt measured, controlled, but his thoughts were anything but. Memories began resurfacing, not in order, not neatly. Leila asking questions he dismissed as curiosity. Her quiet pauses when Victor spoke. The way she used to stop mid-sentence sometimes, as if deciding whether something was worth saying. He had called that hesitation weakness. Now it felt like restraint. Alexander stopped near the window, city lights trembling below. For years he'd believed power meant never hesitating, never doubting, never looking back. But looking back was all he could do now. He pulled open a locked drawer and removed an old tablet, one he hadn't used since before the divorce. It contained archived personal logs, notes he never shared, thoughts he never voiced. He scrolled to a date. 4 years ago. The night before the report arrived. Victor says caution is survival, he had written. Father would agree. Alexander closed his eyes. He had outsourced his instincts. That was the real betrayal. The next morning he didn't go to the office. That alone sent shockwaves through the company. Victor called twice. Alexander didn't answer. Instead, he drove. No destination at first, just movement. The city unfolded differently from behind the wheel than from above it. Slower, messier, more honest. He stopped outside a quiet building he hadn't seen since the divorce was finalized. Leila's old law firm. He didn't go inside. He sat there, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, and remembered the way she used to look when she was thinking. Eyes slightly unfocused, lips pressed together, mind working beyond the room she was in. She had never been reckless. That should have mattered. Alexander drove away, not toward forgiveness, toward understanding. Leila noticed the shift before she could name it. It came as a subtle pressure, emails unanswered, meetings delayed, systems behaving oddly, not failing, pausing. Someone was slowing things down on purpose. She leaned back in her chair at the co-working space and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. This wasn't sabotage. It was restraint. Her fingers tapped once against the desk. Alexander. She didn't want to think his name. She thought it anyway. Leila had learned to recognize patterns not just in data, but in people. Alexander, when cornered, didn't explode. He withdrew. He observed. If he was pulling back now, it meant he was seeing something. That realization brought no relief, only caution. By midday, Alexander requested an off-the-record audit, not internal, independent. The firm he contacted specialized in corporate betrayal cases, the kind that never reached court because reputations were the real currency at stake. The lead auditor listened without interruption. When Alexander finished, there was a pause. "You already know the answer," the auditor said. "I need confirmation," Alexander replied. "You want truth," the man corrected. "Confirmation is comfort." Alexander said nothing. The auditor nodded once. "We'll need unrestricted access," he said, "including your COO." Alexander didn't hesitate. Victor sensed it immediately. The delay, the silence, the lack of reaction. Alexander was no longer acting emotionally. That was dangerous. Victor adjusted his strategy. He scheduled a board briefing, urgent, confidential, framed as reassurance. He prepared slides that told a story of stability, of controlled risk, of decisive leadership. He planned to isolate Alexander again, before truth could organize itself. That evening, Alexander reviewed preliminary findings. They weren't conclusive, but they were directional. Financial movements disguised as operational decisions, influence layered into advice, a narrative shaped slowly, patiently. Victor hadn't stolen Phoenix. He had redirected Alexander. That was smarter. That was worse. Alexander closed the file and sat in silence. He thought of Leila again, of the way she'd said, "Look at me and tell me I'm lying." He hadn't looked long enough. Leila packed up late that night. As she stepped outside, her phone vibrated. Unknown number. She considered ignoring it. Then she answered. "Leila," Alexander's voice said quietly. Not commanding, not sharp, just human. She closed her eyes. "Yes? I owe you the truth," he said. "But first, I need to understand it myself." She didn't respond immediately. Then, softly, "Be careful what you uncover." The line went dead. Alexander stared at the phone. For the first time since the divorce, he felt fear, not of loss, but of responsibility. Victor watched the city from his office window, expression unreadable. Alexander had moved faster than expected. That was disappointing. Victor opened the contingency file again. He read the final line. If exposed, burn the bridge entirely. He smiled faintly. Some truths, once revealed, couldn't be survived. Just before midnight, the independent auditor sent Alexander a secure message. "We found the manipulation point. It started with your marriage." Alexander's hands went cold, because now the question wasn't who betrayed him. It was why Leila had been chosen first. The words refused to soften with time. "It started with your marriage." Alexander read them again, slower, as if pace could alter meaning. His hands rested flat on the desk, fingers spread, grounding himself against the sudden shift in gravity inside his chest. He had expected numbers, power roots, financial sabotage. He had not expected Leila. He closed his eyes not to escape the thought, but to examine it honestly. If Victor had manipulated him through marriage, then the betrayal wasn't opportunistic. It was deliberate, targeted. Alexander opened the secure channel with the auditor again. "Explain," he typed. The reply came measured, professional. "She fit the criteria." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What criteria?" There was a pause long enough to feel intentional. "Someone close enough to influence you," the auditor wrote, "but distant enough from power to be framed as expendable." Alexander leaned back, breath slow and controlled, though something sharp twisted beneath his ribs. Expendable. Leila's calm strength, her refusal to perform ambition, her habit of asking why instead of how much. Victor hadn't chosen her randomly. He had chosen her because she would never fight dirty. That made her easy to destroy. Alexander's throat burned. Morning broke without ceremony. The city carried on, indifferent to the fact that a man who had ruled it quietly was now struggling to stand upright inside his own mind. Alexander canceled every meeting on his schedule. Victor noticed immediately. So did the board. Concern turned to speculation. Speculation to fear. Alexander didn't care. He drove instead. Not to the office, not to Leila. To a place he hadn't visited in years, his father's old study. The room smelled faintly of leather and dust, memories preserved in furniture and silence. Alexander stood in the doorway for a long moment before entering, as if stepping inside meant acknowledging how much of himself had been shaped there. He went to the shelf marked Strategy, pulled out an old notebook. Inside were his father's handwritten rules. Not advice, rules. Trust is leverage, love is exposure, marriage is alliance. Alexander closed the notebook slowly. Victor hadn't invented the manipulation. He had exploited a belief Alexander already carried. That realization hurt more than betrayal. Leila sat alone in her rented apartment, laptop open but untouched. She sensed something shifting again. Deeper this time. Not noise, not disruption. Reversal. Her phone lay face down on the table. She hadn't blocked Alexander. She also hadn't saved his number again. Boundaries didn't need drama. They needed clarity. Leila stood and walked to the window. The street below glowed with ordinary life. She wondered, not for the first time, whether she had ever truly belonged to Alexander's world, or whether she had simply been allowed to orbit it. Her phone buzzed. A message from the same unknown encrypted source that had warned Alexander. This time it spoke to her. You were chosen because you couldn't be bought. Leila's breath caught. She read it again. Then once more. Her fingers trembled slightly as she locked the phone. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt angry. Back at Sterling Tech, Victor reviewed the board briefing alone. Alexander's absence was becoming a liability. That could be corrected. Victor placed a call to one of the board members. Careful, controlled. Alexander is unstable, he said quietly, emotionally compromised. The seed was planted. Victor had always known how to speak fear fluently. Alexander returned to his office late that afternoon. Victor wasn't there. That absence spoke volumes. Alexander accessed the executive surveillance logs, another layer Victor believed irrelevant. He scanned footage, timestamps, entries. Then he saw it. A meeting from years ago. Victor, Alexander's father. Private. Alexander's heart slowed. He pulled the audio. Static at first. Then voices. Marriage grounds him, his father said. Vulnerability. Creates distraction, Victor replied smoothly. But distraction can be redirected, Victor continued, especially if the attachment is temporary. Alexander's hands clenched. Temporary. Victor had planned the end before the beginning. The marriage hadn't been protection, it had been leverage. Alexander shut the file and stood abruptly. The room felt too small. Leila replayed the message in her mind as she paced her apartment. She had known something was wrong. She had felt the subtle pressure, the invisible wall forming around her life. But knowing why changed everything. She hadn't been rejected because she was weak. She had been removed because she was strong in the wrong way. Ethical strength threatened systems built on control. Her phone rang. This time it was Alexander. She answered without greeting. I know now, he said. There was no excuse in his voice, only weight. She leaned against the wall, eyes closing. Knowing isn't the same as undoing, she replied. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I'm asking for time. She exhaled slowly. For what? To dismantle what I allowed to exist, he said. She didn't answer immediately. Then, softly, be careful. Systems don't collapse quietly. The call ended. Victor finalized the contingency. If Alexander exposed the truth, Victor would expose something else. Reputation was fragile. Alexander's was built on certainty. Victor prepared to shatter it. Alexander sat alone that night, lights off, city glowing beyond the glass. For the first time, he saw the full shape of the damage, not just corporate, not just personal, moral. He had believed he was protecting an empire. In reality, he had allowed it to be weaponized against the one person who had never tried to use him. That truth didn't demand punishment. It demanded accountability. Alexander opened a new file, not an audit, a confession. As Alexander prepared to send the file to the board, a new notification appeared on his screen. Emergency board session, initiated subject. Removal of CEO authority filed by Victor Hale. Alexander froze because Victor hadn't just planned for exposure. He had planned to strike first. The notification didn't blink. It didn't warn. It simply existed. Final, cold, procedural. Removal of CEO authority. Alexander stared at the screen, feeling something unfamiliar settle over him. It wasn't panic. Panic wasted energy. This was clarity sharpened by inevitability. Victor had moved, not defensively, decisively. Alexander closed the file he'd been preparing and locked his terminal. If Victor wanted control, he would take it through structure, not force. Boards didn't act on emotion. They acted on narratives. And Victor had been writing that narrative for years. Alexander straightened his posture, adjusted his cufflinks, and stood. If this was going to end, it would not end with him scrambling. The boardroom filled slowly, not with urgency, but with tension disguised as routine. Men and women Alexander had built alongside took their seats without meeting his eyes. Tablets lit up, documents synced. Legal counsel waited at the edge of the room like vultures trained to smile. Victor entered last, calm, unhurried, almost gracious. "Thank you for assembling on short notice," Victor said, taking his seat without invitation. "Circumstances require immediate oversight." Alexander remained standing. "Circumstances you manufactured," he replied evenly. A murmur passed through the room. Victor raised a hand gently. "This isn't personal," he said. "This is governance." Alexander smiled faintly. "That's the lie you've been practicing longest." Victor's eyes flickered, just once. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "We're here to address concerns regarding executive judgment," she said, "specifically related to internal instability." Alexander finally sat. "Define instability," he said. Victor leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "Erratic decisions," he said. "Shutdowns without board approval. Cancelled meetings. Emotional interference stemming from personal matters." Alexander nodded slowly. "So," he said, "you're punishing me for noticing theft?" Silence. Victor's tone softened. "For imagining it." Alexander turned to the board. "Phoenix wasn't breached from outside," he said. "It was modified internally, permissions adjusted, assets quietly liquidated." Victor sighed. "Unsubstantiated," he said, "and dangerously conspiratorial." Alexander opened his tablet. "Then explain this." He projected a screen, audit traces, timeline overlays, behavioral patterns. The room leaned forward. Victor's smile thinned. "These are interpretations," Victor said, "not proof." Alexander met his gaze. "Their motive." Leila watched the market fluctuate from her laptop, seated in a quiet corner of the co-working space. Sterling Tech stock dipped sharply, then steadied. Something was happening, not collapse. Reorganization. She closed her laptop slowly. Power struggles always revealed more than balance sheets. They revealed character. Leila didn't know what Alexander would do next, but she knew Victor would overreach. Men like him always did. Back in the boardroom, the vote loomed. Not final removal, suspension of authority, temporary, strategic. Alexander listened as legal language wrapped itself around intent like silk around steel. Victor watched him closely, waiting for the crack. It didn't come. Instead, Alexander stood again. "One final point," he said. The room stilled. "If I were unstable," Alexander continued, "I would be defending myself emotionally. I would be denying responsibility. I would be bargaining." Victor frowned slightly. Alexander tapped the screen again. "But instead, I'm stepping aside." Gasps. Victor stiffened. "I'm authorizing an independent continuation of the audit," Alexander said, "with full transparency." The chairwoman blinked. Victor's composure faltered. "You can't," Victor began. Alexander raised a hand. I can, he said. And I am. He turned to the board. If I'm guilty, remove me permanently, he said. But if I'm not, his gaze shifted to Victor. You'll need someone else to blame. The room buzzed. This wasn't retreat. It was bait. Victor recovered quickly. Very noble, he said lightly, but dangerous. Alexander smiled. So is underestimating me. The suspension passed. Alexander walked out of the boardroom without looking back. Victor remained seated, jaw tight. The game had changed. That evening, Alexander met the auditors privately. You'll have everything, he said, including my own failures. The lead auditor studied him. You understand what exposure costs, he said. Alexander nodded. Yes, he replied. I've already paid part of it. Leila received another encrypted message. This one was different. It wasn't warning, it was confirmation. The board has moved. So have you. She exhaled. For the first time since the divorce, she didn't feel like an outsider watching a storm. She felt positioned. Victor paced his office late into the night. Alexander had chosen transparency. That was inconvenient. Victor made another call. This one wasn't to the board. It was to an old contact. If the audit completes, Victor said quietly, he survives. A pause. Then accelerate external pressure, Victor continued. Force a liquidity crisis. He ended the call and stared out at the city. If Alexander wanted truth, Victor would give him consequences. Alexander sat alone in his apartment, lights off, watching the city breathe. He thought of Leila again. Not as a symbol, as a person. He sent her a message. I stepped aside, she replied minutes later. That's not weakness. He closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he believed it. Just before dawn, global markets reacted. Sterling Tech's largest creditor quietly transferred a massive block of debt. The buyer's identity was masked, but the signature strategy behind the move was unmistakable. Alexander stared at the notification. Because whoever now held that debt held his future. The notification didn't come with noise. No alarms, no flashing warnings, just a line of text sitting calmly on Alexander's screen, as if it had always belonged there. Majority debt position. Transfer complete. Alexander read it once. Then again. Debt didn't scream the way equity did. It didn't boast. It waited, quietly, patiently. Debt didn't ask for permission. It demanded obedience when the time was right. Alexander leaned back slowly, eyes unfocused, breathing steady despite the tightening in his chest. Whoever held that paper didn't need to announce themselves. They already owned leverage. He accessed the transaction trail, shell entities, layered jurisdictions, clean execution, professional, not predatory. That detail mattered. Predators rushed, professionals positioned. Alexander closed his laptop. He already knew what this meant. Someone had believed in the collapse before it happened. Someone had planned for it. Victor received the same market alert an hour later. He smiled at first. Liquidity pressure meant panic. Panic meant control. Then he saw the numbers. His smile faded. This wasn't fragmentation. This was consolidation. One buyer, one strategy. Victor leaned forward, eyes narrowing. That wasn't how chaos worked. That was how architects worked. He made 3 calls. 2 didn't connect. The third ended too quickly. Victor felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Uncertainty. Leila sat in a quiet conference room that didn't carry her name on the door. Yet, the space smelled of polished wood and fresh ink. A legal team sat across from her, respectful, alert, precise. They didn't speak until she did. Confirm the position, Leila said calmly. The lead attorney nodded. You now hold controlling debt, he said. Any restructuring requires your approval. Leila folded her hands. And Sterling Tech? Dependent, he replied. Extremely. She absorbed that without visible reaction. Power didn't require performance. Good, she said simply. The attorneys exchanged glances. They had expected triumph. They received restraint. Alexander arrived at Sterling Tech later that morning, not as CEO, not as authority, but as presence. The building felt different now, quieter, more cautious. People watched him with uncertainty, unsure whether to treat him as fallen or dangerous. He passed Victor in the corridor. They didn't stop. They didn't speak. Their shoulders brushed lightly. Victor smelled the shift before he understood it. Alexander wasn't cornered. He was waiting. In a private meeting room, Alexander met with the audit team. The lead auditor spoke carefully. "The debt transfer complicates matters," he said. Alexander nodded. "Or clarifies them." The auditor hesitated. "You know who it is," he said. Alexander looked down at the table. "Yes," he replied. "I just don't know why she hasn't said it out loud yet." Leila reviewed the final documents alone. She didn't feel victorious. She felt steady. This wasn't revenge. This was structure correcting itself. She remembered Alexander's face the night he told her to get lost, not the anger, but the fear underneath it. The fear of losing control. Now, control was sitting quietly in her hands. She hadn't taken it from him. He had given it away. Leila closed the folder. Not yet, she thought. Timing mattered. Victor convened an emergency strategy call. His voice was smooth, but his words sharpened. "We're dealing with an unknown hostile entity," he said. "We need to protect the company." One board member spoke up. "Unknown?" she asked. "Or unexpected?" Victor's jaw tightened. "Either way," he said, "we cannot allow an external force to dictate terms." Alexander listened from the back of the room. He said nothing. Victor noticed, and that silence bothered him more than opposition ever could. Leila received a formal request for negotiation, not from Alexander, from the board. She read it once, then set it aside. She made her own call. To Alexander. He answered immediately. "I know," he said before she spoke. She allowed a small pause. "Do you?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, "and I won't pretend surprise." She exhaled. "Good." They sat in silence on opposite ends of the city, connected by the thing that had once broken them. Truth, arriving late, but intact. "I'm not here to punish you," Leila said, "but I won't protect you from consequences either." Alexander closed his eyes. "I wouldn't respect you if you did." Victor watched the stock stabilize unnaturally. Too calm, too controlled. That wasn't market behavior. That was human intervention. He slammed his fist lightly against the desk. "Find the buyer," he snapped. His assistant hesitated. "We're trying," she said, "but every lead dissolves." Victor understood then. The buyer didn't want to be found, which meant they were already inside the system. Leila stood by the window as evening settled. Her reflection stared back at her. Not the woman who had been dismissed, but the woman who had endured. She didn't feel like she had won. She felt like she had arrived. Her phone buzzed, another encrypted message, this one unsigned. "Victor is preparing a counterstrike." She didn't respond. She forwarded it instead. To Alexander. Alexander read the message and felt the final piece slide into place. Victor wasn't retreating. He was escalating. That meant the endgame was close. Alexander typed one message. Then it's time to step into the open. The following morning, a mandatory board announcement was scheduled. Agenda Item 1, Introduction of the Controlling Creditor. Alexander stared at the agenda, because in a few hours the room would learn the truth, and he didn't know whether Leila planned to save the company, or finally let it fall. The boardroom smelled faintly of polished oak and corporate confidence. Lights were bright, but not blinding. Chairs arranged neatly, every tablet synced to the main presentation, every eye fixed in cautious anticipation. Alexander arrived early. He didn't take the chair at the head of the table. Instead, he lingered near the window, arms crossed, observing the subtle movements, the anxious tapping of fingers, the quiet shifts of papers, the faint glances exchanged between executives. Victor sat confidently, leaning back in his chair as if he owned the room, but his eyes flicked to Alexander with a calculation that was sharper than usual. He knew the moment had come. The CEO's office had become a theater, and he was both actor and audience. The doors opened. Leila entered unannounced, yet composed. She didn't need introduction. Silence filled the room. Whispers halted. Phones were set aside. The air changed, charged with a tension that only truth can produce. Alexander's heart didn't race. He didn't panic. He simply watched, measuring. Leila's presence was deliberate, commanding without demanding. The black suit she wore was tailored perfectly, her posture upright but relaxed. Eyes steady, face calm. There was no trace of the woman who had been dismissed, underestimated, or mocked. Only power, precise and undeniable. The chairwoman cleared her throat, but no one spoke. Leila finally opened her mouth. I believe it's time the board understood the situation completely. Her voice was quiet yet firm. It carried authority without arrogance. Victor's smile faded slightly. He realized that the game had shifted. He had anticipated confrontation, not command. Alexander leaned forward, elbows on the windowsill, studying her. He had underestimated her presence before, and he would not make the same mistake again. Leila gestured to the main screen. The presentation began, not a corporate slideshow, but a meticulous mapping of financial flows, operational shifts, and decision-making manipulations. Every line traced the movement of Sterling Tech's debt. Every chart explained how control had quietly shifted. The board's faces changed, shock, confusion, awe. Their confidence faltered as they realized the scale of what had been orchestrated behind their perception. Victor cleared his throat. "This isn't how we do things," he said, voice firm but controlled. "This is procedural chaos disguised as strategy." Leila's gaze met his. "This isn't chaos. This is accountability. And it's time someone who built trust rather than undermined it was acknowledged." Alexander's pulse quickened, not from fear but from recognition. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for clarity, precision, justice. Victor leaned forward, attempting to regain control. "You may have purchased debt, but purchasing debt does not grant you authority over operations." Leila smiled faintly. "Authority isn't taken with money alone. It comes from vision, understanding, and integrity. The board will see that, and so will you." The chairwoman cleared her throat again, this time with weight. "Given the evidence presented, and the demonstration of financial leverage, it appears the controlling interest resides with Ms. Leila Johnson. Are there objections?" A murmur ran through the room. Victor's hands clenched on the table. He was aware acutely that the rules of his game had changed. Alexander exhaled slowly. He had expected anger, confrontation, chaos, but this calm, deliberate assertion unsettled even him. Leila continued, addressing the room. "I have no interest in dismantling the company. I am invested in its ethical continuation and sustainable growth. However, manipulation and deceit will no longer dictate its trajectory." Victor's attempt to interject was halted by the chairwoman's sharp look. Silence returned. Alexander moved slightly closer to Leila, though she didn't notice. He felt relief tempered with tension, relief that she had arrived with precision, tension because he understood the cost of her involvement. Leila turned her attention to Alexander briefly. "You were not the threat," she said quietly, yet her tone carried resonance through the silent room. "You were misled, and now it's time to correct that misdirection." Alexander's jaw tightened. He nodded slightly, silent acknowledgement. For the first time, he allowed himself to see clearly. Victor had orchestrated everything. The marriage, the betrayal, the manipulation. All of it had been a strategy designed to control him through emotional leverage. Victor's hands twitched on the table. He could feel the walls closing in. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling, not with accusation, but with undeniable transparency. Leila advanced one step, commanding without moving aggressively. The company cannot thrive on fear or deception. It must thrive on competence, trust, and vision. That is what I offer. The board shifted in their seats, murmuring quietly to one another. Questions were forming, skepticism rising, but there was no denying the clarity and authority in Leila's presentation. Victor leaned back, his mind racing. He calculated, recalculated. Every strategy he had prepared, every contingency, now faced a factor he had underestimated. Precision born from ethics, intelligence, and patience. Alexander finally stood fully, facing Victor. "This is your choice now," he said. "You can resist, or you can adapt, but the board will see the truth one way or another." Victor's eyes flicked to Leila, then back to Alexander. He realized painfully that he was no longer the one dictating the pace. For the first time in years, he was reacting. Leila concluded her presentation. "I do not seek revenge. I seek correction. I will safeguard the company from misuse, not because I have to, but because I am capable." The boardroom was silent. Every seat carried a weight of anticipation. Even Victor's practiced calm had cracks showing through. Alexander allowed himself a small, controlled exhale. The magnitude of what had just happened was undeniable. Control had shifted, not through brute force, but through strategy, patience, and moral authority. Victor finally spoke, voice quiet but tense. "You think this changes everything?" Leila met his gaze without flinching. "I know it does." Alexander remained at the window, silent observer. He felt the tides turning, not chaos, not victory, but inevitability. The board members glanced between Victor and Leila, realizing that the narrative they had trusted was now being rewritten before their eyes. Leila turned off the screen and addressed the room one final time. "The company survives, but not under deceit. Decisions will now reflect integrity. That is my commitment." Alexander moved closer. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The acknowledgement in his eyes said everything. Victor slumped slightly in his chair. He knew the game had changed. He wasn't defeated, yet, but the advantage had shifted, subtly, but irrevocably. Leila gathered her documents with calm precision. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Power, once earned, did not require display. Alexander's hands rested on the table quietly. He looked at her and finally understood the weight she carried, the patience it required, the intelligence behind every calculated step. Victor's eyes narrowed. He could plan, manipulate, and act, but now he faced someone who anticipated patience and intelligence in equal measure. The boardroom remained silent. Time itself seemed to pause, waiting for the next move. Alexander exhaled softly, steady, deliberate. He felt a mixture of relief and tension. The storm was not over, but clarity had arrived. Leila's gaze swept across the room, calm, unyielding, decisive. No one had expected this. Not Victor, not the board, not even Alexander. Minutes later, Victor received an encrypted message on his personal device. "You underestimated her. One wrong move and everything collapses." He looked up at the boardroom, at Alexander, at Leila, and realized that the next move would determine more than power. It would determine survival. Victor's fingers trembled slightly as he read the message again. "You underestimated her. One wrong move and everything collapses." He hadn't underestimated her. He had thought he controlled the narrative. He had miscalculated patience, foresight, and moral precision. Alexander stood nearby, observing the storm in Victor's mind without intervening. The air was thick, almost tangible, filled with the tension of every misstep Victor had ever taken. Leila remained composed at the head of the boardroom, calm, focused, every gesture deliberate. She didn't need to speak to assert authority. Presence alone sufficed. Victor rose, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He attempted confidence, but Alexander and Leila saw through it. The strategy that had once made him untouchable now faltered under scrutiny and foresight. "You think a single debt transfer gives you control," Victor said sharply. "You've destabilized everything. The company is mine by tradition and influence." Leila's eyes were unwavering. "Influence built on deception is fragile, Victor. Authority built on clarity and integrity lasts." Alexander stepped closer to Leila. His presence was quiet but firm. "You've always had the intelligence to see beyond fear. Now, you have the leverage to correct what was broken." Victor's jaw tightened. His plans, layered over years, felt exposed. Every manipulated decision, every subtle coercion now revealed. He understood. Leila wasn't seeking revenge. She was offering justice. That distinction terrified him more than any board vote could. Leila spoke calmly, projecting to the room. "The Phoenix Protocol and the company's assets have been safeguarded. Internal manipulation has been documented and addressed. Any further decisions will be transparent, accountable, and ethical." The board remained silent, awe mixed with relief. Even Alexander could feel the magnitude of her control, not just over the company, but over the system of trust that Victor had corrupted. Victor's voice faltered. "You can't. This isn't legal," Leila interrupted, quietly but with authority. "It is legal, and it is necessary. You misled everyone, Victor, but your deception ends here." Alexander's pulse was steady. Relief and tension intertwined. Relief that the manipulation had been exposed. Tension because the next step required precision. Leila walked slowly toward the front, laying a folder on the table. "This includes full documentation. Every decision, every modification, every deliberate misdirection. The board will review it, and the company will move forward transparently." Victor's hands clenched into fists. "You think this gives you the right to take everything?" Leila shook her head. "I am not taking. I am restoring. You built fear into the system. That system ends today." Alexander stepped closer, his voice calm, deep, and measured. "You misled me too, but she has not misled the company. That difference matters." Victor's face reddened. Anger, fear, and disbelief mixed. His influence crumbled in silence. The weight of truth was heavier than his arrogance. Leila turned her attention to Alexander. "You don't need to fix everything alone. You never did. This is why we're here, together." Alexander's throat tightened. He remembered the nights of doubt, the weight of power, the betrayal, and the loss. Seeing Leila standing there, commanding and calm, he realized that the empire he had fought to protect was not defined by fear or isolation, but by vision and integrity. Victor attempted one final argument. "You think you can simply undo years of control? Authority built on influence cannot be erased overnight." Leila's voice was steady. "Authority built on deceit cannot survive honesty. The board will determine the course. I have simply restored clarity." Alexander exhaled. Finally, relief mingled with admiration. The woman who had been discarded, underestimated, and wronged was now the anchor of what they had both failed to protect properly before. The board voted unanimously to approve Leila's oversight. Victor's objections were overruled. The documents were accepted, signed, and stored. Every transaction verified, every asset safeguarded. Victor slumped, silent. He had lost, not through force, not through chaos, but through integrity, strategy, and patience. He realized for the first time that Power without ethics was always temporary. Alexander finally spoke softly. Leila, you saved more than the company. You saved what it meant to stand for something beyond fear. Leila turned to him. Her gaze softened just slightly. You didn't need saving. You needed to see clearly. Alexander nodded. The weight of pride, arrogance, and regret lifted slightly. And now? He asked. Leila smiled faintly. Now we rebuild, together or separately, but with clarity. The past informs us, but it does not bind us. Alexander felt the truth in her words. All the manipulation, betrayal, and lost time could not undo the lessons, nor the opportunity to restore integrity. Victor exited silently, understanding that any further resistance would only expose him more. His empire of influence had collapsed quietly under the light of honesty. Alexander and Leila remained. Silence fell over the boardroom, not tense but reflective. The city beyond the windows continued, indifferent, yet a transformation had quietly occurred inside these walls. Alexander reached out to Leila, not to control, not to command, but as acknowledgement. She accepted the gesture, not as submission, but as recognition. The company, once a battlefield of deception, was now a canvas for ethical vision. Leila gathered the remaining files, ready to guide the company into sustainable growth. Alexander stood beside her, not overshadowing, not controlling, but learning, observing, and finally understanding. The quiet power of truth had replaced fear. Integrity had supplanted manipulation. Lessons had been learned at the cost of pride, but the outcome was lasting. Victor's shadow remained, but diminished. He could act, but now only in the limits imposed by clarity, observation, and ethics. Leila walked to the window, surveying the city. She wasn't triumphant. She was resolute. Alexander joined her silently, a companion in vision, a witness to the new era. The storm had passed. The battlefield remained, but the war of ethics, integrity, and foresight had been decisively won. Silence fell, not heavy, not oppressive, but filled with possibility. Alexander finally whispered, almost to himself, "You were always worth more than I understood." Leila's eyes met his, "And you finally see it." For the first time in years, both felt the equilibrium of justice restored, not revenge, not dominance, but understanding and rightful authority. As the boardroom lights dimmed, a final encrypted message appeared, this time addressed to both Alexander and Leila. The Phoenix Protocol was only the beginning. Now the real challenge begins. Together, both exchanged a glance, not fear, not uncertainty, but recognition. They were no longer alone, and the future, untamed, uncertain, and full of possibility, awaited them.